Good evening. I'm Adrian Vale, and for the past 3 decades, I've wandered through cities, deserts, and forgotten villages, searching not for destinations, but for questions. Today, I invite you to join me in perhaps the most accessible laboratory of moral philosophy we possess: the cinema. I remember sitting in a theater in Gotham. Well, not Gotham exactly, but a crumbling cinema in Detroit that might as well have been, watching Todd Phillips's Joker for the first time. Around me, the audience sat in uncomfortable silence. Some shifted in their seats, others wept. And I saw something familiar. I saw the same moral vertigo I'd experienced reading Dostoevsky in a monastery in Greece, or discussing justice with a former soldier in a cafe in Sarajevo. The question isn't whether films can teach us ethics. The question is, can we afford to ignore what they're already teaching us? Let's begin with Immanuel Kant, that meticulous Prussian who never traveled more than 10 miles from Königsberg, yet mapped the entire universe of moral law. Kant gave us the categorical imperative: act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now Arthur Fleck, a man brutalized by society, suffering from mental illness, caring for his ailing mother in a city that has abandoned them both. When we first meet Arthur, he's trying, desperately trying, to follow what Kant might call the moral law. He wants to bring laughter and joy to the world. He cares for his mother. He attempts to connect with others, however awkwardly. But here's where Phillips presents us with a devastating question. What happens when following the moral law offers no protection? When kindness is met with violence? When the categorical imperative encounters a society that has already universalized cruelty? Arthur's transformation isn't simply a descent into madness, it's a philosophical crisis. On that subway train, when he kills those 3 Wayne Enterprises employees, he crosses a threshold. Can we apply Kant's second formulation here? Treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. Those men treated Arthur as less than human, as a means to their entertainment. But when Arthur kills them, does he not reduce them to mere obstacles, means to his own liberation? This is the moral paradox at the heart of the film. Violence begets violence, each act justified by the previous injustice, until the categorical imperative collapses entirely. But Kant isn't our only guide through this darkness. Friedrich Nietzsche, that prophet of the death of God, offers us a radically different lens. And perhaps uncomfortably, Joker is more Nietzschean than Kantian. Nietzsche spoke of master morality versus slave morality. Master morality, born from the strong, defines good as noble, powerful, beautiful. Slave morality, born from the oppressed, defines good as whatever alleviates suffering, kindness, humility, sympathy. Gotham's elite, Thomas Wayne and his circle, embody a corrupted master morality. They see themselves as superior, the city's saviors, yet they've lost the nobility Nietzsche associated with true strength. They're powerful, but not admirable. They dominate, but do not create. Arthur begins trapped in slave morality. He absorbs abuse, turns the other cheek, finds meaning in his suffering. "I just hope my death makes more sense than my life," he writes in his journal. This is slave morality in its purest, most tragic form, finding value only in victimhood. But then comes the transformation. When Arthur becomes Joker, he doesn't simply rebel, He attempts what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of values. He rejects the moral framework entirely. "I don't believe in anything," he tells Murray Franklin. This is Nietzsche's abyss staring back. But here's what's crucial, what keeps me awake at night. Nietzsche's Übermensch, his overman, was meant to create new values, to affirm life in all its complexity. Joker doesn't create, he destroys. He's not Nietzsche's ideal, he's Nietzsche's warning. He's what happens when you tear down moral structures without the strength to build something new. No moral philosophy exists in isolation. We are, as Aristotle knew, social creatures. So let's examine the other characters, the moral witnesses to Arthur's transformation. Murray Franklin, played with tragic complexity by Robert De Niro. Murray represents liberal society's shallow empathy. He invites Arthur on his show, but only as a spectacle, a freak to be mocked. He mouths platitudes about kindness, but participates in cruelty when it's entertaining. From a Kantian perspective, Murray's sin is clear. He treats Arthur purely as a means to ratings, to entertainment, never as an end in himself. He violates the fundamental dignity of the human person. Yet Murray doesn't see himself as cruel. He's just doing his job, just entertaining people. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt warned us about. Not monstrous, just thoughtless. Then there's Thomas Wayne. Ah, Thomas Wayne. In most Batman mythology, he's saintly, the moral foundation of Bruce's crusade for justice. But Phillips gives us something more unsettling. A man who genuinely believes he's helping, who may even be objectively improving the city, yet who looks at people like Arthur with undisguised contempt. What kind of coward would do something that cold-blooded? He asks about the subway killings. He cannot imagine, will not imagine, the desperation that breeds such violence. Thomas Wayne fails what I call the moral imagination test. He cannot place himself in Arthur's position, cannot extend his ethical consideration beyond his own class. And Sophie, Arthur's neighbor. Their relationship, or rather Arthur's fantasy of their relationship, reveals something profound about moral connection. Arthur doesn't imagine Sophie as a sexual conquest or even a traditional romance. He imagines her as a witness, someone who sees him, who confirms his existence. When we discover their relationship was largely imaginary, we're confronted with Arthur's profound isolation. Kant believed moral law was universal, accessible to all rational beings. But what happens when you're so isolated, so disconnected, that you can't even accurately perceive moral relationships? Arthur's tragedy is partly epistemological. He literally cannot know what's real anymore. So what does Joker actually teach us about ethics in the real world? Let me share 3 uncomfortable lessons I've drawn from this film and from my conversations with people across the world. First lesson: the social contract is fragile. Kant and most Enlightenment philosophers assumed a basic social framework within which moral law operates. But Joker asks, what happens when society breaks its end of the bargain? When mental health services are cut, when the vulnerable are abandoned, when the gap between rich and poor becomes a chasm. Arthur tells his social worker, "You don't listen, do you? You just ask the same questions every week." This is society's failure, not malicious, just indifferent. And indifference, I've learned, can be more corrosive than hatred. The real-world application: We cannot demand moral behavior from individuals while building immoral systems. If we defund mental health services, if we allow homelessness to proliferate, if we create economic systems that grind people down, we cannot then act surprised when the social contract fractures. Second lesson, empathy is not optional, it's foundational. Both Kant and Nietzsche, for all their differences, struggled with empathy. Kant's ethics are rational, almost mathematical. Nietzsche distrusted empathy as weakness, but Joker reveals the catastrophic consequences of empathy's absence. Every person who might have helped Arthur, the social worker, the bureaucrats, Thomas Wayne, Murray Franklin, they all fail at the basic task of seeing him as fully human, not pitying him, not even necessarily agreeing with him, but genuinely seeing him. I think of the young man I met in a refugee camp in Lebanon who told me, "I don't need your charity. I need you to look at me like I'm a person." That's what Arthur needed. That's what we all need. Third lesson, violence is never the answer, but we must understand why it becomes the question. This is where Joker becomes most controversial and most important. The film does not justify Arthur's violence. Phillips is clear about this, but it demands we understand it. There's a scene where Arthur is beaten by teenagers while dressed as a clown. He's already down, and they keep kicking. That's not just physical violence, it's existential violence, the denial of someone's right to exist in shared space. Kant would say violence is always wrong because it cannot be universalized. Nietzsche would say violence is natural but should be channeled creatively, not destructively. Both would agree that Arthur's murders are moral failures. But here's what the film forces us to confront. If we create systems that do violence to people daily, economic violence, social violence, the violence of neglect, can we be surprised when that violence is returned? This isn't justification, it's causation. And understanding causation is the first step toward prevention. Now, let's turn the mirror around. Let's talk about us, the audience, and the moral complexity of our response to this film. I've noticed something fascinating in discussions about Joker. Some people refuse to watch it, calling it dangerous, a celebration of violence. Others embrace it, sometimes in ways that miss its critique entirely. Both responses reveal something about moral philosophy and practice. Those who refuse to engage with morally complex art often do so from what they believe is a Kantian position. Certain things should never be depicted because depiction implies endorsement. But I'd argue this misunderstands both Kant and the purpose of art. Kant valued reason and examination. How can we reason about evil if we refuse to examine it? Then there are those who identify with Joker uncritically, who see him as a hero. This is perhaps more dangerous because it mistakes diagnosis for prescription. Yes, Arthur is a victim of systemic failure. Yes, his rage is understandable. But understanding is not endorsement. The film shows us how a person becomes a monster. It doesn't tell us to become monsters. This is where I find myself returning to an older philosophical tradition, Aristotle's concept of catharsis. We watch tragedy not to learn to be tragic, but to purge ourselves of dangerous emotions in a safe space, to see the consequences of choices without making them ourselves. Joker functions as a moral thought experiment. It asks, if you were Arthur Fleck, what would you do? And more importantly, What kind of society are you building that might create more Arthur Flecks? I remember a conversation I had with a police officer in Chicago. He told me, every person I arrest has a story that would break your heart, but they still made choices. He's right, of course. Arthur makes choices, but he makes them in a context we collectively create. This is the synthesis I've arrived at after years of thinking about these questions. We must hold individuals accountable for their choices. That's Kant's insight. But we must also recognize that we shape the context in which those choices are made. That's the social dimension Kant sometimes neglected. So why does Joker teach us ethics? Not because it provides answers, the best philosophy never does. It teaches us ethics because it forces us to ask the right questions. Kant asked, "What is my duty?" Nietzsche asked, "What values am I creating?" Joker asks, "What kind of world are we building together, and what kind of people does that world create?" I'm 58 years old now. I've watched societies fracture and heal. I've seen people at their worst and their most transcendent. And I've learned that moral philosophy isn't an abstract academic exercise. It's the daily practice of deciding what kind of person to be and what kind of world to build. Cinema, at its best, is a mirror and a window. A mirror showing us who we are, a window showing us who we might become. Joker is both. It shows us the face of a society that has failed its most vulnerable. It shows us the human capacity for both suffering and cruelty. And it asks us, implicitly in every frame, what will you do with this knowledge? Kant believed that moral law was written in the stars and in the human heart. Nietzsche believed we must create our own values in a godless universe. Perhaps they're both right. Perhaps the moral law exists, but we must choose to see it, to honor it, to build societies that make moral life possible. The lights are coming up now, the film is over, but the questions remain. And that, my friends, is exactly as it should be. Philosophy doesn't end when we leave the theater. It begins. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until next time, keep questioning, keep watching, and keep building a world worthy of the moral law we carry within us.